This meeting is being
the
recorded.
world of the National Naval Officers Association and our ongoing presentations of Black History Month programs. As we celebrate our 50th anniversary of existence, and our big conference and symposium will be held at Annapolis, Maryland, the 24th of July through the 29th of July in our year of our Lord, the year 2022. The National Naval Officers Association represents the area of the improvement of diversity and inclusion and mentoring within the ranks of the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, the United States Coast Guard, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Public Health Service. I'm Captain Roosevelt Rick Wright Jr., historian, United States Navy retired for the National Naval Officers Association. And tonight I will serve as moderator of this most needed historical African-American History Month program. On behalf of Admiral Sinclair Harris, President of the National Naval Officers Association, our NNOA Board of Directors, and the brilliance of our most treasured membership of over 1,000 members throughout the world, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. And today's topic, the Black Officer Corps, a history of Black military advancement from integration through Vietnam, title of a great book that has been written by our incredible guests that we have tonight. Our guest speaker, military historian, scholar, Dr. Isaac Ike Hampton II, is the senior historical historian and command curator at the Air Force Global Strike Command at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana. Hampton also serves as an adjunct professor at the great Louisiana State University, LSU, national champs in football about a year ago, where he teaches African and Latin American history. Wow. Dr. Hampton is originally from Urbana, Ohio. He's a Buckeye and an Army veteran. Hampton earned his PhD in 20th century US history from the University of Houston, where his research focused on the conditions of the African-American officers' experience concerning unfair promotion, systemic racism, and the influence of the Black Power movement on African Americans serving in uniforms during the Vietnam era. He received his master's degree in history from Texas Southern University, one of our largest historically Black universities here in the United States of America, and his bachelor's degree from the Jack Appleseed University up there in Ohio. They got another title now, Urbana University. But prior to his appointment at the Air Force Global Strike Command, Hampton served as the branch chief historian of the Army Quartermaster Corps from 2018 to 2019. And prior to this, he served the U.S. Army South Command historian from 2009 to 2018. As an educator, Dr. Hampton has more than 15 years of university teaching experience, where he's taught courses on Vietnam, African American, and U.S. military history. Dr. Hampton has been a guest speaker at the Pentagon, contributed to PBS's KLRN, The Vietnam War, Stories from South Texas in support of Ken Burns, the Vietnam series. Got a dynamite brother on the scene here tonight. In addition to the Texas Historical Commission documentaries on Texas during the First World War, he has also appeared as a subject matter expert on numerous Texas radio stations. Dr. Hampton is currently finishing a manuscript for his next book, which is an edited volume of oral histories with African American officers who fought in World War II, Korea, and the Vietnam War. I'd like to thank the DC chapter of the National Naval Officers Association and Captain Jerome Davis for allowing us the opportunity to take their chapter monthly meeting time to do a worldwide presentation with Dr. Isaac Ike Hampton II. Ike, I'm telling you, man, I come to find out your mentor, Dr. Luther Brown. I haven't seen him in years, man. Your mentor was one of my incredible colleagues and student here at Syracuse University back in the 1970s. And Dr. Brown at that time was doing his master's degree in television, radio, film under the great late Dr. Larry Myers, who was my advisor when I did my PhD here at Syracuse in the world of instructional technology and radio. You told me you want to get into radio, man, the other day. But right tonight, I need you as a historian, a historical scholar. Dr. Hampton II, welcome to the National Naval Officers Association and our Black History Program series here in the year 2022. Greetings. Hey, look, brother, every inconceivable thing that could be thrown to an ancestry of people in a country, our ancestry over the last 400 years has been laid on the table to keep us from succeeding. Thank God we have. Give us the story. What happened? How did we make it? How did we come this far, as they say in the AME Zion Church, in the United States military as officers? Bravo Zulu to you, Doc. You got it.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Wright. That was a heck of an intro and kind of tough to follow. But to answer your question, when you look at the arc of African American history, over from enslavement through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, up and through the Jim Crow era, up and through the 1960s, Civil Rights and Black Power, you see the same thing over and over. And that theme is overcoming and adapting. And African Americans basically taking control of the narrative. Sometimes it was a very quiet narrative, depending on where they were at and the survival tactics that were available to them. That's one thing that you have to look at African Americans when we look at them in military uniform or in the civilian sector, is that African Americans developed what was known as survival tactics. I call it accommodative resistance, because there had to be a level of accommodation, but they're always working behind the scenes to gain ground. It's subtle. It's very subtle. But as you look back down the road, inch by inch by inch, crawling, walking, then running, and today we're flying.
Dr. Hampton, I tell you, I just say, we've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord. It's not failed us yet. Amen. And right tonight, it is a pleasure to have you aboard, and you have an incredible presentation about what has really happened to us. And of course, Colonel Butler, that incredible report that he did years ago, looking at the problems that Army officers were faced with, is the same story across all branches of the military. United States Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, and the United States Coast Guard. Hey, roll that presentation for us tonight. Tell us what we need to do. What have we been up against? And especially to the young junior officers, listen up. Bravo Zulu to you.
Okay, so before I start, let me get a couple of formalities out of the way, and rightfully so. That again, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk with you, and I'm truly honored to be the NNOA's guest speaker. So let me generously thank first Admiral Sinclair Harris, my good friend Captain Jerome Davis, for the invitation to be the guest speaker for the NNOA's Black History Month observation. I also want to thank the technical support staff and Ms. Kawan Hurst and Commander Marlo Haran and Lieutenant David Teray, and of course you, Dr. Wright, for being our great moderator. So again, you're making this a lot of fun, taking a lot of pressure off. So I appreciate that, brother. Okay, so look, let me start our talk, our discussion with a couple of quotes, and I'm going to use a couple of quotes tonight. But in the words of the great Marcus Garvey, and I quote Mr. Garvey, "A people without knowledge of their past, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." The next quote that is even more drawing in, that is more salient to what we're talking about, is from the Bible, Hosea 4:6, and it reads, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And I'm tying that into the historical knowledge of the African American past. Now, when we look at African American history, less than 1% of people in the United States will ever take a formal African American history class, specifically at the college level. So again, Black History Month, this is basically the only time that the country receives any type of real exposure to the Black American experience. If you really begin to look at some of the older narratives, you see that African Americans are almost invisible. They're invisible to the narrative unless you really dig. And let me just give you a quick case in point. Over this past weekend, as I'm doing some research for one of my future book projects, again, looking at the Vietnam War, and I received a DVD with pictures from the archive, National Archives, and it had over 400 pictures on it. And out of those 400 images of people in Vietnam, you know how many I saw with African Americans? Less than six. Less than six. And we had over 300,000 Blacks serving that war. So look, I get it. Look, there's tens and tens and thousands of images of the war in Vietnam. And maybe I got the disc that didn't have that many African Americans on it. But what I'm saying, it's alarming that if a person were just to use that little metric, those images, you would think, wow, well, hardly any Blacks served during that war. Okay. And so again, this is the reason why it's so important that we really dig and look at the different streams of African American history. Okay, so for my talk tonight, these are going to be the takeaways that I want folks to hopefully come away with and that I can hopefully get across. And number one, get a broader understanding of the African Americans' experience in the armed forces during the Vietnam era, the power of institutional racism in the military, and patriotism in the face of racial animus. So let me do this at first. Let me give my first public service announcement, my first PSA, because during my talk this evening, I'm going to enlist some oral history interviews. And let me explain that when you are a baby historian, when you're coming up in a PhD graduate program, one of the first things that they teach you is that you must write and analyze from an objective position. Well, let me say that oral history sources are not objective. In fact, they are highly subjective. And in many ways, this is their great strength. Oral history, therefore, tells us not just what people did, but what they intended to do, what they believed they were doing, and what they now think they did. So as a trained historian, I believe it is essential that you have to work from multiple research fronts. And with this, you aspire to vet human memory and convert that into a usable history balanced against traditional sources. When I mean traditional sources, those written on paper, official histories, these sorts of things. So when we put all this together, it basically helps us have a better understanding of the past. Let me give a case in point. When you begin to talk with minorities, particularly African Americans, they tend to have a different memory of what happened versus traditional history, that top-down history that has largely excluded what they remember. It just talks about them, but not to them. And so one of the examples that I like to use is this. So picture yourself, you and your significant other, and you're in a car. And right now you're the passenger and you're riding up a mountain. You're taking everything in. It's beautiful, the mountains, the trees, the greenery. And then on the way back down, you're taking the same road, but this time you're the driver. You're the driver. And so what this does is that it provides each person two perspectives. And while each perspective is different, they are both credible. And you have to juxtapose that against that perspective of traditional history, largely written by white Americans, and the other perspective that is very valid, that is the interpretation by African Americans. Okay. And so again, some would call this, well, as we begin to bring a new historical interpretation to the world, some would call that revisionist history. Should we have a progressive and fresh view of history, new incredible scholarship on blacks by blacks? Well, my reply to those who say it's revisionist history, it's no good, my reply would be, hell yes, we definitely need to have revisionist history. And that doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that we have a new pool of historians who have a different perspective, who have a different view that's adding to the greater body. If we didn't have a type of revisionist or updated history, we would still be stuck with the racist, bigoted history that was written back in the early 1900s that looked at African Americans as less than other. Okay, so that is the reason why we really have to respect and embrace the new histories, as long as it's done in a professional way that is true to the craft. So again, this is highly important. So let me start with another quote to set this up. And I want to quote the great Thurgood Marshall. I wish I could say that racism and prejudice were only distant memories. We must dissent from indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent because America can do better, because America must do better. And again, for Thurgood Marshall, who is behind the work for the NAACP, was a part of the Brown v. Board, obviously the first African-American Supreme Court justice, a part of much civil rights legislation. That really sets up my talk when we begin to talk about the Vietnam era. In many ways, this quote contextualizes it because blacks in and out of uniform, this is what they were calling for, is for the country to actually do better. Now, when we begin to look at the amount of literature that looks at the United States military during the Vietnam era, very little has been done that focuses on African-American military officers during this period. So as I began to do primary research, one of the things that I noticed is that there was a hole in the literature. And again, this is something that really fired me to do more research. So when I first went to the National Archives 2 in Maryland, when you're really beginning to ramp up and do your research, I got with one of the most renowned archivist who knows Vietnam sources, and his name was Rich Boland. And before I made my trip, I told him what I wanted to do. And he says, okay, Isaac, come on up. And so what they do, they give me a private tour because I'm a doctoral student. They show you all these archives. And then at the end of the tour, I'm ready to jump into the archives. I said, okay, Rich, you know what I'm looking for? I'm looking for things on systemic racism. I'm looking things on racial unrest. I'm looking for things on how the military dealt with all this racial tension. And Rich looked at me and looked down and put his hand over his mouth and said, Isaac, you're not going to find any of that here. And I'm like, why'd you have me come up here then? Right. And what Rich wanted to do was he basically wanted me to kind of change my topic because, again, they're just the military and the government is not in the business of keeping types of sources. All right. They're basically too embarrassed to write those sorts of things. So again, to put that in academic terms, the history of African Americans in the military has been predominantly written from a top-down perspective, where when we look at African American officers, the official military history failed to capture the unique personal challenges in the midst of the civil rights and Black Power movement. So as a historian, what do you do? Well, I'll tell you what you do. You have to go out and almost create this history. And that requires working from private collections. It requires going to the the Black press. It also requires for you to do oral history interviews. And I've done hundreds of oral history interviews with African American enlisted and officers. And most of the men in this picture that you see here, I was able to interview. Obviously, I couldn't interview Gravely and a couple of the others, like Rogers. But what I'm getting at is that to a man, after I finished interviewing them, they all said the same thing. They said, Isaac, I've been interviewed, but no one ever asked us questions about this sort of thing. Okay. So again, we see that much of the traditional press and official histories tended to look at African Americans with an insular attitude and not an exploratory one about them and their unique challenges as a race in uniform. So we see that during the 1960s, the race was experiencing a new and cultural awakening and was disillusioned by the broken promises of President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, deep racial animus and violence against African Americans after the passage of the Civil Rights Movement, the remaining yet powerful Southern bloc that still had a hold on racial politics, the rise of the Black Power movement after 1967, which influenced many African Americans to reassess Black advancement and their place in the United States racial and social landscape. So let's talk about commissioning sources. So here in this slide that I have up, I want you to just take in some of the numbers and the totality of it, where you have to understand that during this period, over 70%, really close to 75% of officers who would go into the Army would be commissioned through HBCU ROTC programs. Okay. Now, when we look at OCS, okay, it's barely 4% when we look at Black officers during Vietnam. Well, it's still a number. Again, it wasn't as significant as the HBCUs were. And then when we look at the numbers for the academy down here at the bottom, between 1971 and 73, approximately 36 African Americans were commissioned at West Point compared to nearly 2,500 white Americans. Okay. And the other number I want to share with you, that 1971 in the Army, there were only, let's just say there were less than 500 female officers in the Army at that time. Excuse me, black female officers at that time. Okay. So again, now what this does is that this is going to be one of those push and pull factors that creates problems for African Americans, that they have that it doesn't relate to them in the sense it's not their fault. So what hurt Black officers as they are moving through their careers from lieutenant to captain to major and so forth, we're going to see that when their ratings for their OCS, for their OERs is going to be looked at, we see that most white rating officers would be unfamiliar with historically Black colleges. Okay. Number two, we see that most African American officers would hold reserve commissions and not a regular Army commission. And number three, probably one of the greatest problems was that there was little to no racial diversity or gender diversity on Army promotion boards until we really get to the early and mid 1970s. Number four, Black officers basically had few godfathers or benefactors or advocates who could mentor them in the early parts of their careers. We don't see that until we get into the mid and late 70s as we see Black officer ascension in the Army. And the other issue is that it's just going to come down to racism, is that Blacks in leadership positions disturb the natural order. We see that many whites still could not see African Americans leading soldiers into battle, particularly, when we look at the 50s and 60s, Black officers telling whites what to do. It's still not quite accepted. Of course, we see white troops move out under Black officers and do a great job, but again, there's still a great number of white soldiers who have a problem with this. And the other one is going to be implicit bias. And I say implicit bias because we see that many of the white officers in the 60s and 70s, well, many of their mentors are going to be those from the World War II and Korea era. And some of these same types of implicit or status quo biases are going to be passed on to that next generation of particularly white officers. Okay. Not to mention, we have to look at the period we're living in, civil rights, Black power. I mean, look, we don't even have integrated housing at that stage. So again, these are all the forces that are working against African American officers. And let me say this, is that the military was not in the business of really changing people's thinking when it came to race until after 1972 with the creation of DRIVE. That stands for the Defense Race Relations Institute at Patrick Air Force Base. Okay, so again, the military really wasn't concerned with this sort of thing, not in earnest until we really get until the late 60s and early 70s. So again, these are some of the things that are the forces. That's what's affecting Black officer ascension, and I'll talk more about that as we go. So let me get to our first oral history interview cut. And the reason why I have Colonel Butler next to ROTC is that he's talking about how he felt as an African American going from total segregation to total integration in the officer basic course. And remember, this is year group 1955 that he's coming out of Prairie View. But just a little quick background on my great friend and mentor who's no longer with us, God rest his soul. Again, Colonel Butler is from Waxahachie, Texas. He becomes a pilot, more than 3,000 hours of flying, fixed wing and rotary aircraft. He fights in the Battle of Ia Drang. Any of you saw the movie We Were Soldiers? He was at that battle. Again, this is what he shares about his experience of becoming a new officer.
I got to Fort Benning and I was in BILC-1, basic officer, basic infantry officer.
Oh, whoa. Try that again. Sorry, group.
I got to Fort Benning and I was in BILC-1, basic officer, basic infantry officer course number 1. And that's where all the West Pointers were put in because they always got the first class. And I was quite a bit apprehensive, if you can understand that, because here I am, a guy finished a historical Black school, put in the midst of the brightest, what I've always been told, the brightest and the best. And I was concerned, how am I going to compete? I said, I know why they're washing these guys out. Jesus Christ, I'm going to have a time competing with the bright and the best. And I believed that until I started going to class. And then I found out that I got a better education than most of them had got at West Point. Because you can't hide it in the class. Either you got it and you got it. So I knew that to try to demonstrate that would get me nothing. So I just kind of had fun. And those guys be studying at night and all of that thing. I'm out having a drink at the American Legion because I thought it was pretty easy. And this is when I learned that talent is distributed equally amongst all races and culture. The problem is the ability to develop or demonstrate the talent is not equal. That's the problem. I mean, that's the way it is. That's why I always tease some people and said, for a while, like in basketball and football, they said, well, you Blacks have got the ability to do this. That's because you went to Africa, you were born and raised in Africa, you got the bone structure and all that. And now I brought it to attention to some people. I said, well, these white guys wasn't raised in Africa, and they're doing pretty good out there. I said, I think your philosophy is that. I mean, they had this guy from China doing real well out there that he had nothing to do with Africa. So he's got the talent, and they're giving him an opportunity to develop it and demonstrate it. That's what the problem is. So that's what I found out, that somebody had been lying to me, that it's an individual thing. And when I was in flight school, I learned to control, they really come after you. They may give you a hard time in the cockpit. They try to get you upset. They yell and scream at you. Your instructor does, hoping that you start concentrating on him rather than trying to learn how to fly the plane. So I learned how to ignore him completely, just wipe him out of my mind. And they kept raising the bar on you. Okay. And because when you do something, they raise the bar. And I found that they learned too late. By raising the bar, they made me better than I ever wanted to be. I worked my butt off. I met the bar, and then once you do that, they know this, and now they've got a very serious problem because they turn you loose where you can demonstrate how good you are. That's it, and that's when I learned that being a minority, they'll make you better, but you'll never get an opportunity. Or very rarely will you get an opportunity to demonstrate. Because they know that if you get out there and demonstrate, they say, wow, this guy's good. And then the thing was,
Okay. So again, those are very prophetic words that, again, even today, we can look at certain things where for African Americans, a lot of times the bar is always being moved around. Okay. But again, Dr. Butler set that up very well. And so the next clip, and remember, what these clips are doing is that they're contextualizing the period. And what I want to call this is raw history. Okay, these are the actors that lived and went through this. Okay, it isn't just a simple interpretation. This was their experience, and that's the one thing about oral history is that all the statistics and and narrative is nothing unless we have the voices that live that experience. So these next couple of clips are from an enlisted Marine. And with this, we're going to see that this gentleman by the name of Michael T. Gardner, I interviewed many years ago. He's the first clip. He talks about what it was like being black in Houston, Texas, in the 1960s. This is before he goes to the Marine Corps, and he talks a little bit about sit-ins. Okay, so we'll get to the Marine stuff, but this clip's only about a minute. So again, Dr. Bose is about the longest one, but here we go.
Ever was around white people was when I went to the military on a close basis, you know. I can remember my niece being a social worker and taking us to River Oaks and putting us on a panel for the white children to question us, to ask us different questions, you know.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, how old were you then?
I was in my teens. Must have been about 13, 14 years old.
So, why did they do that? I mean, was it to educate both races?
Right, exactly. Yeah, just to give them a feel for us, and I guess us a feel for them. But I didn't get much out of it. Like I said, I didn't really socialize or be in a setting with whites until I went to the military.
Okay, so again, that's the way that, and let me explain this. River Oaks, to this day, it's one of the wealthiest areas of Houston, Texas. Even the Bushes, they have houses there. Okay, so again, as Mike gives this perspective, now let's fast forward to Prairie View and how he winds up going into the Marine Corps. And what this does, listen, look, this story that I'm sharing with you, think of all the pieces that go to it. This is not just one man's story. It's many stories with many African Americans probably went through something very similar as far as them wind up the pressures of joining the military.
Yeah, I had been there a year, and I went that summer session and had done well and improved my grades. And then my mother had given me my tuition money, and I gambled I lost my tuition money shooting dice. And then I had a young lady that was pregnant, and I had a lot of pressure on. And I think I stayed at Prairie View for about a week or two. I was trying to wait until my 18th birthday so I could join the military, because rather than face my mother, I would rather fight the war. And when I volunteered, and she found out, boy, she was hurt. You know? She was devastated. Yeah. So on my 18th birthday, I left.
Wow. So were you drafted, or did you just?
I volunteered.
You volunteered.
I was going to be drafted because my grades had not, and I didn't want to go to the Army. So I said, well, I always wanted to be a Marine.
So you just wanted to be a Marine?
Yeah, I wanted to be a Marine.
Okay.
So I volunteered for the Marine Corps.
What did your friends say?
Everybody thought I was crazy, especially with a war going on. But I don't regret my decision. because it shaped me. It made me a better person. Had I continued down the road that I was going, I probably would have ended up in the penitentiary. Because I would have bad with the people.
So the service had a huge effect on
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
Okay, and just so the group knows, I have forgiven Mike about his comments about not joining the Army. So, all right. So this last clip I want to play with Mike. Now, this clip he talks about in combat in Vietnam, and this one experience really changes his view for the rest of his life. And let me give another PSA. There's some harsh language, so have your earmuffs ready.
That's good.
Yeah, and you know, Michelle, I'm gonna tell you something else. When I got wounded, when I got my Purple Heart, I got flash burns. Like we had one side of the hill, and they had the other side. At that time, I was carrying an M79 grenade launcher. Okay, and they had us just shooting all night long, shooting a grenade launcher. It was all the grenade launchers in the platoon were right up there at the top of the hill, just shooting constantly. Well, one of them sneaked up and threw a. No, I was asleep. We took a break and I went to sleep. We were supposed to be 100% watch. One of us stand, one of us sleep, you know? So the dude who was from Detroit, a black man, his name was Elliot Haskins. Never will forget it. He was supposed to be standing watch, but he had left me, okay? So when I wake up, I hear gunfire, and then I hear something fall in front of me. What happened is the enemy had threw a satchel charge. And like a shotgun, that's what they had, a grenade. It blew up. And when it blew up, I had to put the helmet, I just put the helmet on. And it blew up in my face. And it turned me a complete flip, you know? I turned a complete somersault. But when I come back down, I couldn't see, you know, because I had flash burns. So I was crawling around, you know, I said, hey, I can't see. So the corpsman, who was actually in the Navy, the Marine Corps medics, Navy personnel, he was scared to death. He had a hole, he shook. So I crawled over there and said, medic, Marine hurt. He comes over and he looks at me and says, you got flash burns, you'll be all right. Then he went back to the hole. Then this white boy, the sergeant, if you don't get your motherfucking ass out of that, excuse my expression, this is what he said. If you don't get your motherfucking ass out of that hole and take care of this Marine, I'm gonna blow your brains out. You know, and he got out of the hole and did what he was supposed to do. But the reason why I got wounded is because Elliot Haskins left his post and went down shooting shit with somebody else down the line. Okay? So I got wounded because of a black man, and I got taken care of because of a white man, a white sergeant, you know? Elliot Haskins ended up throwing grenades at the CO and going crazy, and then sent to the rear.
Oh, he tried to frag somebody?
Yeah, he went crazy.
Okay. So again, that's Mike's story of Vietnam. And again, there's a whole lot to be unpacked from that. But I use his clip because again, you really see from his time in Houston to how things had changed when he was in Vietnam. And again, I believe it changed some of the ways that he saw the world. So putting that all together, and have to understand the time of the 60s, the rhetorical message of that period from men such as Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King, Ron Karanga of the US organization, Bobby Seale, and Stokely Carmichael was a combination of racial confluence, Black solidarity, cultural awareness, and civil rights advancement for African Americans. Their message rarely supported an African American's decision for a military career. And they quickly reminded soldiers that the United States had never been fair to its citizens of color. So the question remains, how could Blacks rationalize serving a nation that did not give African Americans, did not allow them to enjoy all of the civil, social, and political rights of American citizenship? And again, I just found this amazingly puzzling until I really began to talk with him and do the research. And really, most served out of a sense of patriotism for their country. Even obviously being drafted is a little different. But once they're there, again, they're not fighting for the country many times. Sometimes they're fighting for the man next to them. But in the end, most of them, to a man, are pretty much happy. Hey, you know what? I did what was right. I wanted to honor my family as well. Number two, others served because military service fulfilled a sense of adventure. You have to remember that a lot of these African Americans who were drafted are going to come from the inner city ghettos or from some rural backcountry area. And again, this is an escape for them. And that ties into number three. Then the 1950s and 60s, joining the military economically was one of the best places for African Americans to go. And number four, other reasons were based on the historical cultural mandate that dates back as far as the Revolutionary War. In the sense that when African Americans took on the role of soldiers to join their white citizens in common defense for a national struggle, Blacks were provided an agency not only to prove their fighting prowess on the battlefield, but also to secure their place in the country and gain rights. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, military service was the surest instrument for advancement. Now, I want to talk about the Vietnam argument and if it actually helped Blacks as far as ascension when it comes to military promotion. So again, initially to those who haven't done the research, you would think, yeah, this is, Vietnam had to help African Americans. It gave them more exposure, but certainly exposed them to more combat. So the fact that the war helped Blacks and to actually move up and gain other positions is not entirely true. It was not entirely the war as a catalyst that gave Blacks more opportunity. So we see that strangely, on a positive note, between 69 and 72, there was a 30% increase in the number of African American majors, 04. So this would give some merit to the argument that Vietnam was positive for Blacks. However, the factors for Black advancement are attributed to a couple of things. And number one is going to be the Congressional Black Caucus. Again, that would bring pressure as far as on the political side of having Blacks become White House fellows, the pressure to have more Black and at flag officer positions and as senior leaders. Number two would be Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird's 1969 Domestic Action Council that spearheaded the development of race relation programs in the military. And number three, the Army established an official affirmative action program in 1972. So again, while Vietnam did give Blacks more exposure as far as leadership opportunities, again, it wasn't the only thing as far as, hey, this combat experience is what did it. It was just one factor. And keep in mind that when you look at cause and effect, it's hardly ever monolithic. It's usually pluralistic, where it's more than one thing, factors that are pushing the narrative. So if anything, what it did bring out is the fact that the military was dealing with institutional, also known as systemic racism, versus overt Johnny Reb KKK discrimination. So we see that the Black soldiers' experience with systemic racism was a constant reminder of their limited opportunities compared to their white brothers in arms. So let's go to a little bit of what I'm going to call technical analysis. Now, for our military members in here, unfortunately, I can't read the audience, but in most cases, the rank of 04 major in the Army is going to be the turning point in an officer's career, okay? And I want to tie this chart into the idea of Black advancement and the war helping Blacks, okay? So just stay with me. Now, what we're looking at here, this is the data that I was able to garner from the Butler report, Dr. Butler's study. Now, this is just probably 1/5 of it, but over the course of 3 years, he taught me the calculus on how to put all this together. and analyze the numbers and put it in the charts. Butler was a mathematician, so he's very good with numbers. I'm a historian. I don't do math as well as I do other things. Okay, I'm just being honest. Okay, so look, stick with me. So this is OER 67-4. In the years it ranged from is 1956 to 61. Okay, and when we look at this number here, this is the highest number. Okay, this is the best you can score. All right, and so obviously the blue is for Black, Negroes, what Blacks call themselves then, and the red is for Caucasian. And so when we look at the scores, we see for African Americans going up, 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 and they plateau right here at the 110 range. When we look at white ascension, it's going up, 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 and then it plateaus. It's almost like a double plateau at the 120 and 130. Well, what does the math tell us? It tells us that Blacks are scoring 10 to 20 points behind whites. Okay. So again, they're being scored 10 to 20 points lower than white officers on the OERs. And I guess for the Navy, we call those fit reports. Okay. So now, to stick with me, let's fast forward that basically 10 to 15 years when we get to the Vietnam period, the throes of the war, 1960 to 71. This is OER 67-6. Now, the scoring numbers have changed. Okay. Again, we have a higher number to represent top of the heap. And so again, let's look here. So the argument is, hey, Vietnam's helped Blacks. They're doing better. They're scoring fine. Well, here we go. Up, up, up. And here, Blacks plateau where? Right at the 220 mark. Whites plateau right here at the 230 mark. Again, we see that there's another 10-point difference where Blacks are scoring. Okay. So again, we see that there's a differential, and this is going to play in to the lack of Black ascension. Now, stick with me. I want to give another example, and I want to come back to this. Just stay with me. All right. Now, here we are to lieutenant colonels, which is a commander in the Navy. So it's the same OER, 67-4. We see that Blacks will plateau right here at the 110, and whites will plateau right here at 120. Again, another 10-point difference. Here, let's move again to OER 67-6. Same time period. We moved ahead around 15 years. Blacks will plateau here at 220. Whites will plateau here at 230. Again, the same thing at the different ranks. Blacks are not being scored the same. And so again, look, this is basically, as I go back, look, it's a distinction without difference. Okay. Blacks are being scored at these other, at the lower areas here. And they say, well, listen, Blacks are really doing better. Look, we have 15% here, you know, but the average Blacks are here. And so let me just throw this out to the audience. In the military, one has average ever been good enough if you're a person of color? Never has been. And so the reply is this. Look, all the action is up here. All the action's up here. And Blacks are scoring back here. So they're not getting the plum assignments. They're not getting a regular Army commission, and they're not being promoted at the rate that, again, we see systemic racism playing into this. Okay. So to answer your questions about the big why behind this, it's going to be this, that the majority of African-American officers did not hold a regular Army commission. They held a reserve commission. Number two, for their ratings, as we've already talked about, they went to HBCUs. Hey, how could anything coming out of an HBCU, again, remember the idea about Black inferiority, how could it begin to measure up with a traditional white school, such as Ohio State, University of Texas, Texas A&M? Okay, so this is the other thing. Also, there's the unfamiliarity with HBCUs, okay? And the other thing too is that when you look at the data with this, and again, I can talk about this all day, we don't have much time, is that African-American regular Army officers were rated about the same as a white reserve officer commission. So again, more than race, or equally as much as race, it's going to be by component. And that component was going to be tied to a white reservist. Okay. Let me give one more point here. This comes from Colonel Joe Alton. He was a contemporary of Dr. Butler, and he talked about this when we talk about Black officers need to be competitive and how they must quiet their critics. And this is what he said to his division commander. Sir, the system makes us competitive. We have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. The system weeds us out early, and the few that get through that sieve know they have to be very good. We can't depend on your subjective judgment when you sit down and write an OER. We've got to give you things to think about that are objective, things that you can see, feel, and count. And that's why we focus on those things that are quantifiable. Hopefully, that will override any subjective opinion you have about us when you look at what the soldier has done, how the soldier has performed, and what is his readiness. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. All right, moving forward. So I want to spend this last section talking about overwhelmingly what all of my officers mentioned was they could not have been successful at all without the support of their wives. So again, the Army wives were a key component as far as keeping the home fires burning, establishing a support system for their men, and also to help them establish what I would call social networks. Now, keep in mind during this time, look, as late as the 80s, at least in the Army, spouses would be mentioned on OERs. I've seen OERs that said Jim and Judy make a wonderful command team. So again, the wife has to support her husband and the institution. Now, this book, these books that I have up here, written by Nancy Shea, this is basically the first, what I would call how-to book, how to be a good military wife, okay? And remember, the military isn't giving its soldiers extra bonus money to help take care of a family. So again, it almost becomes a financial challenge in many ways. But what the Army did, it quickly reminded wives that a distracted husband was a dead husband. And that plays into Army wives' basic responsibilities. And this, and I'm serious, this comes out of Shea's book, okay? And so this is really interesting, really apropos after Valentine's Day of what this could mean, okay? Right on time. So again, her job was to make a congenial home, rear a family of which her husband could be proud of. Her job was to strengthen her husband's morale, and of course, practice the science of good housekeeping. Now, if that doesn't ensure marital bliss, I don't know what does. Now, after interviewing dozens and dozens of these officers' wives, I've concluded through deep forensic research that these wives will remind their men that they'll be facing something much worse than turbulence if they forgot that these women were their life partners and not their soldiers. So again, this sort of thing, hey, it could be a long night if they try to imbue these types of things on what Shea's book said about what makes a good Army wife or a good military spouse. Now, the other thing, this goes across all races, is that the armed forces consistently projected ideas of patriotic duty on military wives so that they would view separations and overseas duty stations where the entire family would accompany the soldier. They would look at it as adventures or challenges and not troublesome pitfalls of being married to military personnel. So like today's spouses of both races, they would double as fathers, they would double as bus drivers, they would double as a home repair and appliance repair people when they can't get someone to do the job or they can't get someone to show up to fix something. So again, this is going to be a tough life. Now, particularly for African Americans, once they're off base, particularly in the 60s, they can't live in the best part of town, and they still have to contend with segregated schooling. So this next clip is from Miss Inez Sadler, and she's going to talk about what it was like to be a military spouse and some of the things that she faced, even as an educated professional who had a degree.
talk about what you remember concerning the racial climate during the Vietnam era. You know, we have Black Power,
Okay.
civil rights, Dr. King.
Okay. During a part of that time, during the early 60s, 60 to 62, we were in Germany and pretty much not involved as much. Then we came, we went to Fort Benning. My husband was stationed at Fort Benning. And there, being on post was almost kind of like being isolated because you were the wife of a black officer and you were involved in the military. We didn't get as involved in civilian affairs as we might have. I always felt that we were somewhat isolated. But the things that were happening in the civil rights movement definitely had an impact on what was happening with us. For example, when I answered your question earlier, especially for the early 60s, I said that the climate was charged. Things were changing, but white America was not ready for them to change. And they got a little bit heated, I think. And I'm telling you how black officers and their wives were affected. There was a black colonel who was traveling between, I believe, Fort Bragg and Fort Benning, who was killed by an irate white person. When I was traveling with my daughter by bus in the South, we stopped in Mississippi. The buses stopped for a rest and so forth. And I was confronted by a white guy in the bus depot while my child was eating a snack. He had been making some insulting remarks, and he came to me and said that my kind was not served there. And I asked him if he was the manager, and he said no. So I told him he couldn't tell me what to do, but I was really, really afraid. So that's why I say things were charged. Things were changing, slowly, but changing. Another thing that happened, because of what Dr. King and others were doing, things were opening up, and black people were beginning to be more assertive. While I was at Fort Benning, I applied for a teaching job, and I held at that time a lifetime certificate from the state of Texas for both elementary and secondary school. And the superintendent told me that my qualifications were not acceptable for the state of Georgia. She would let me teach kindergarten, but I had to qualify for Georgia by taking a number of courses. And it didn't matter that there were white teachers all over Georgia teaching who did not even have a bachelor's degree. And I know this because I took classes with some of those people.
Okay. So again, that shows that the challenge of what, again, the spouses had to go through. All right. And then here, just quickly, many of my officers were, when they would PCS across the country, remember most military bases are strewn across the South, they would be given what was known as green books. Now, I'm sure most of us have probably seen the movie, The Green Book, about Dr. John Shirley, that looks at the Deep South. But again, the fact that, every 3 to 4 years, you'd have to take your family through this. The fact that you can't stop where you want to, you can't get a bite to eat where you want to. So again, all this is just all the pressures that African-American families had to go through. The fact that they're in defense, serving in defense of the nation. So it's just mind-boggling. In closing, concerning military service, the vast majority of African-American officers from the Vietnam era believed their contribution to the advancement of the race came from working on the inside of the system by affecting policy and maintaining high standards. It would be counterproductive for Black Americans to meet staunch racists on their own ground. For this generation of officers of color, it was more productive to evolutionize over revolutionize based on non-productive attacks on the system. Major General Robert C. Gaskill, Howard University class of '52, and the first African-American deputy commander of the United States War College stated the following. We had to, our goal, we had to overwhelm our critics with professional competence. The act of fighting inequities and injustices with competence and professionalism practiced by the vast majority of Black officers helped alter many races' preconceived notions that officers of color could not measure up to their white contemporaries. So put simply, we have a generation of officers who want to make things better for the next generation. So by examining the contributions, humility, professionalism, and the challenges of these men and their families in overcoming areas of race during a time of war, it shows us individuals with astonishing character. The journey of the African-American service member through the Vietnam era was a complex one. Their actions serve as an example of African-Americans' commitment and sense of duty in the face of inequality and racism. But let me say this, there is still work to do. And we as military leaders, retired, parents, grandparents, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, all this sort of thing as adults, we can serve as the example. Because look, people are watching us. People are watching us, and it's up to us to show people equality and common decency, simple decency of how you treat people, no matter the gender, the color of their skin, their ethnicity, religious tolerance. Again, this is the type of America that Dr. King envisioned, and it's for us to live up to that. And so again, I throw out to you, what are all of you going to do? And a quote I like to use by Muhammad Ali is this: don't count the days, make the days count. Make the days count for whatever you do to help the next generation and share the greatness of Black history. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Dr. Isaac Ike Hampton II, historian, curator, United States Air Force Command, Strike Command, thank you so much for that incredible, informative, and most analytical historical treatise on what we have faced, and also a foundation of us keeping on serving this country of ours. And of course, as I've indicated earlier at the beginning of our presentation today, every inconceivable thing that could be done to a people has been done to our folk. And the thing that's so incredible about the US military, the United States Army, United States Navy, United States Marine Corps, United States Coast Guard, United States Air Force, is that we came to serve our country. I mean, to fight for our country. We raised our hand to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I think of so much of the World War I brothers, the 369 Harlem Hellfighters. When they came back from Germany, there were two lines coming off the ship, one for colored soldiers and one for white soldiers. And the systemic racism and the DNA of our American blood keeps, an incredible people, our folk. We show up every time to help this country. And of course, a country that never really wanted us. And I think that is a true, incredible ability of the African-American story here in America. I'd like to thank you so much. And on behalf of the National Naval Officers Association and our great leader, Admiral Sinclair Harris, the board of directors, for being our guests on this incredible day as we celebrate African-American history. I'm the historian of the National Naval Officers Association, and Dr. Hampton, we're celebrating 50 years. And our organization was created during those incredible days of the 1970s when everything was coming unglued. And of course, our organization came aboard to promote diversity, inclusion, mentoring, and to lay a foundation to tell our story. Also, as we close tonight, and I'm sure I'll give an IT team, we got any questions or anything, you can, Quan and Marion and all our great, David, all our great IT members might have assistance with doing that. But the bottom line I want to indicate tonight is that we are dealing with a country right now that's behind it, and they're trying to erase our history, and we're not going to let that happen. Over.
Captain Wright. I think Admiral Harris would like to say a few words. I believe he's calling in, so I'm going to try to get him on live right now.
Roger that. Stand by for a word from our great president, Admiral Sinclair Harris, United States Navy, president of the National Naval Officers Association. Over to you, Admiral Harris.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, roger that. We got you loud and clear.
So I watched all the presentations there for about 2 minutes while I was coming down here for a meeting. But Dr. Hampton, thank you. Bravo Zulu is what we use in the Navy to say well done. It's our highest compliment. And my highest compliment to your outstanding lecture, the information that you shared, and the way that you shared it. It was phenomenal. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We want to take your book and put it on our NNOA website, our library. Dr. Wright, Captain Wright, as always, you bring an air of elegance and sophistication to everything that you do. And I appreciate you leading this conversation and facilitating Dr. Hampton. So thank you both. Again, thank you to our IT team that does such a wonderful job. And thank you to the DC chapter of NNOA for allowing us to steal the speaker that they had scheduled for themselves to share with many. So thank you to Jerome Davis, to the president, Tom Abernathy, and the Hall of DC. Thank you.
Roger that. So again, on behalf of Admiral Sinclair Harris, the board of directors of the National Naval Officers Association, we're standing strong. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and everybody go onto our website. We're going to be showing up in Annapolis, Maryland on the 24th of July, my birthday, until the 29th of July. And Dr. Hampton, stand by, because we're going to have a historical legacy day on the 29th of July during our big conference. And we are going to show our history and let people know what we are about and what we have done. You know, as I close tonight, I'd like to tell, I'm a guy of the 60s, graduate of Elizabeth City State University in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. I grew up in the Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard. And I never forget, when I was a kid growing up, all of the African-American sailors and Coast Guards were only messmen and cooks. And then finally, roughly in about the 1960s, new brothers were showing up. I never forget the late Milt Moore, United States Coast Guard, radarman, brilliant brother, second class petty officer who eventually became a lieutenant commander in the Navy, was one of my great heroes. And of course, I like to tell everybody that when I was a kid growing up in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, I was barred from going to the public library. But here on this 15th of February, the year 2022, look what has happened to us. We're standing strong, and I salute you. So on behalf of the NNOA, I don't know if we have questions or time for that. I think we're just about it, and we're done. But anyhow, God bless all of you. Stay strong, and go Navy, go Army, go Marine Corps, go Air Force, and go Coast Guard. Bravo Zulu, out.